Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Welcome to our program. Our forums occur most Sundays at noon and are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend. For more information about our forums, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Today we have Paul Sullivan speaking, and Douglas Bauer is going to be introducing him. Douglas is a forum committee member. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Paul Sullivan. Paul Sullivan's actually been a UU for more than 2 decades, and he did spend 7 years here in Austin, during which time Bonnie and I got to know him pretty well. Paul is currently the Deputy Secretary in charge of Communications and Public Affairs for Governor Brown in California. And out there, he works with CalVet, CalVet's an organization that has a budget of more than $400 million and employs more than 3,200 state workers. Paul is actually here today as a UU. Before I turn Paul loose, I'd like to give you a little bit of information about his background. Paul is an Army veteran, which is a good thing, talking about veterans issues. And he served in the 1st Armored Division during Gulf War I. You have to remember there were actually 2 Gulf Wars. And his awards include the Army Commendation Medal and the Southwest Asia Service Medal. His academic background is he has a degree in political science from West Georgia College, and he also has a master's certificate in project management from George Washington University. Paul has been working in veterans organizations for many years. Paul and other veterans have fought diligently for the rights and recognition of fellow Gulf War veterans that became ill due to toxic exposures during the 1991 Gulf War. Also, I need to commend Paul. His advocacy and other veterans resulted in more than 400,000 veterans who are deployed to any war now receiving VA disability benefits and free VA health care for PTSD. Paul and other veterans also helped to set up toll-free suicide prevention hotlines. Paul has been featured on other TV shows, CBS News, CNN, ABC, and 60 Minutes. Since 60 Minutes is on at the same time as the Public Affairs Forum on Sunday evenings, he'll be well equipped to talk to us. Without further ado, I want to introduce Paul Sullivan, who's going to be talking about the causes and consequences of 26 years of war in Southwest Asia. Please help me to welcome Paul Sullivan.
Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be back at Austin and at the first UU here. This is a really nice place to be. And thank you, Bonnie and Doug, for inviting me here. I'm very glad to be here, very honored to speak. I'm here today speaking as a Unitarian Universalist. First and foremost, I believe all of us have a responsibility to make the world a better place, especially for our children. I also need to clearly state that the views expressed here are my own as a Unitarian here back in Austin. Before I begin, let me explain I'm a little bit tired. Yesterday my dad passed away and I've been making arrangements for all that yesterday. So this gives me a little focus of something to do besides talk about that. He was a veteran. He flew B-26 bombers during the Korean War, and he passed away peacefully in his sleep yesterday. So thank you for the kind words of everybody who sent me notes in the last couple of days, or last day. So just a brief moment of silence for my dad as a veteran as we talk about veterans today. Let me start off by saying that right down the street here, that way, on Burnett Road, there was an office for Veterans for Common Sense. It was behind Ginny's Longhorn Saloon where they have chicken, poop, Bingo. It's been featured on CNN. Our office was right back there behind the building, and some of the folks who worked at Veterans for Common Sense at that time are here, and I want to thank them for all that they've done to make sure that the voice I raised had lots of support, and it was very effective. Today's the fourth time I've been here at UU to speak at the Public Affairs Forum, and today's issue is very serious. We're going to be talking about the causes and the consequences of 26 years of continual war in Southwest Asia. My goal here today is to share some information most folks don't know unless you're actively involved in the veteran world. I'm going to talk about how I became involved and then end with some very easy, simple things we can do to help our veterans and welcome us home from the war. So let's start with terms and conditions. I sound like a lawyer up here. I'm not. Let's begin with the term Southwest Asia. For simplicity's sake, let's just imagine it starts at Turkey and goes to Yemen, and then it stretches through Iraq, Kuwait, goes across to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and then it covers a very large section of real estate. It's more than 80 countries and bodies of water that now encompass the Gulf War, global war on terror, however you want to name it. Again, for simplicity, let's talk about the time frame. The Gulf War started on August 2, 1990, and it continues through the present. Let me put right up front, in the military it's called bottom line up front. Our nation, the United States, remains at war in Southwest Asia at more than 80 locations for 25 years, 10 months, and 10 days. That's almost 26 years. That's the longest war in U.S. history. The human and financial costs of the current war are staggering, and there appears to be no end in sight. 8 years ago, my friend, Harvard professor Linda Bilmes, and co-author Joseph Stiglitz wrote a book, The $3 Trillion War. It described the increasing number of war zone deaths, veteran disabilities, veteran health care needs, and much more. It then gave a financial cost of the war, $3 trillion, to the American people. As Bonnie and Doug mentioned before, I worked at VA in Washington as a project manager. And while at VA, I created VA's system to monitor the activity of Gulf War, Iraq War, and Afghanistan War veterans. My staff and I worked with the Pentagon daily to identify the veterans who went to the war zone, and then we worked with others at VA to monitor their health care use, their disability activity, and then prepare lots of reports, and then brief VA senior leaders on what the statistics showed. As Doug mentioned, I'm also a Gulf War veteran. So those two things simply make me a subject matter expert on this, where I can feel that I can speak with a serious level of authority on this subject. Now, after leaving VA and working at Veterans for Common Sense, I used the Freedom of Information Act, you know all about that, to obtain the documents that I created while I was at VA. Those documents were then given to Linda Bilmes at Harvard and Joseph Stiglitz at Columbia University so that they could write their book. It was also given to many reporters to help expose problems at the Walter Reed Hospital, and then the current scandals you've heard about with veterans waiting for care and veterans waiting for disability claims. 2 years after the book was published, Linda Bilmes, Joe Stiglitz, and I testified before the Committee on Veterans Affairs and the House of Representatives. At that time, I estimated the cost to care for our veterans for the remainder of their lives at between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion. The wars have continued almost 6 years since the last time I testified about this subject, and the cost of the war, both financially and in human suffering, continue to grow, rising to unprecedented levels. So let me switch now to the human costs just to the United States. According to the nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy group Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, in a brand new survey they published, 58% of the 2.5 million Iraq and Afghanistan veterans they surveyed reported they are service-connected by VA with a mental health condition. That means about 1.5 new first-time veterans flooding into VA hospitals are seeking and being diagnosed for mental health conditions in the past 15 years. Many more survive and return home with other medical challenges. Please note that not all of our veterans have permanent conditions. Some veterans have temporary conditions. The goal here is to identify conditions early so our veterans know about and then can receive adequate medical care. Here's another key point from the IAVA survey. About 1/3 of the veterans returning back are diagnosed by VA with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Here's another key point. According to Professor Catherine Lutz, a friend of mine at Brown University, here are significant new facts about the cost of the war in a report she just published. First, she said, more than 370,000 people have died due to direct war violence in the war zones as of 2015. Most of those were Iraqi civilians. Last night I obtained the most recent U.S. statistics from the Department of Defense, and as of June 10, there were 7,888 deaths in the war zone between 2001 and last week. Next, Brown University reports 210,000 civilians killed as a result of the fighting since 2003. Third, there are 7.6 million war refugees and displaced persons in Southwest Asia. That's chaos on a massive scale. As we see in the news, the refugee crisis now impacts the entire globe, most especially Southwest Asia and Europe. Fourth, Brown University estimates the U.S. federal price tag for the Iraq War has risen since Linda Bilmes and Joe Stiglitz wrote her book. It's now at $4.4 trillion. Clearly, the costs continue rising as the war continues. After 26 years of war in Southwest Asia, Brown University summarized their findings with this short quote. Quote, "The wars did not result in inclusive, transparent, and democratic governments in Iraq or Afghanistan." Close quote. If you want information, and there's a lot of it, about the costs of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars since 2001, go to the website at Brown University. Now let me switch gears. And for me, this was kind of an epiphany a couple of days ago. I speak a lot at universities, and I'm asked to put the war in context for college students. I love Google. Most Americans know about or have heard about the famous actress Jennifer Lawrence. I think it's J. Law, right? Just not, okay. She won an Oscar for the movie Silver Linings Playbook, great movie. However, Lawrence is best known for her warrior acting role as Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games movies. The films are dystopian blockbuster war based on the 3 books of the same name, marketed toward children. Frankly, as a parent, there can be nothing worse than losing a child. As a war veteran, this feeling is exacerbated because the Hunger Games depict children killing children. Here's the perspective. This was truly a surprise to me. Jennifer Lawrence was born a few days after the Gulf War started. Her entire life has been glamorous, but it's also been in the shadow, the long shadow of the war. Her life now is in sharp contrast to World War II. She has faced no rationing. I'm not aware that she's volunteered to work at a VA hospital. I don't think she's had a blue star in her window. Today, there's no draft, and there's draft registration only for men. What that means, and yes, this is a pun, for the current generation, there's no skin in the game. In this case, the game is the ongoing war. And Jennifer Lawrence is only 25. Within 1 year of the release of her last Hunger Games movie, and this all ties into current events, the Department of Defense finally lifted the discriminatory prohibition against women assigned to combat roles. Today, about 1 in 7 service members are women. That's about 15%. Women have always been in combat in the wars the U.S. has fought since the Revolutionary War. Now there are far more. And today there are discussions in Congress to mandate selective service registration and possible inclusion of women in registration for the military draft when they turn 18. One of the key events in the Hunger Games movie is a type of a draft where one young man and one young woman from each district in this country called Panem are drafted into combat to kill other children. It's like the movie is foreshadowing what's going on. There is one new consequence of both genders serving in the military. Today, more women veterans complete suicide when compared to non-veteran women. And I have a simple question to ask. Is the difference in suicide rates related to training and access to weapons? The early science believes this may be the case. Clearly, just after World War II resulted in a massive change in participation of women in the war economy, today brings another major change. It's already here with more women actively involved with and now leading service members in the combat. And more of our women veterans are returning home with some of the same challenges that men have come back with for generations. So I want to make that note out there, put that marker out there, that the demographics are changing, and we have to adjust. So let me switch back here. What I'm trying to point out is that our nation remains in a state of permanent war. Here's the contrast. There are battles in Iraq, in Syria, and Afghanistan, and untold millions of dead, wounded, displaced, and refugees. However, here in the United States, and this is a difficult subject to raise, we're living in a bubble. We go shopping. I'm guilty of that. We watch movies about war. There's the Hunger Games. And the movies we're watching are about children killing children. The irony is just too strong for me to just understand now. It truly is. It points to a huge disconnect that as a nation and as a people, we're not engaged in the real war being fought overseas, and I don't believe we're engaged enough in assisting our veterans when we come home. So let's move to what I said would be one of the main topics this morning, the causes of the Gulf War. What I want to do is point out 2 items, give a little bit more history because I was involved a little bit in both of these. I was in the war. The causes and the consequences of the current war, look, they're very complex. They go back millennia. I'm not going to relitigate all that. I'm not going to rehash the 2003 build-up and second invasion of Iraq, except to say there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and Iraq was not linked to Al-Qaeda. Thanks. I have to make that very clear. To discuss the start of the Gulf War, the current fighting, let's go way back to July 1990. During July 1990, President George H.W. Bush and his ambassador to Iraq, her name was April Glaspie. She served 36 years as a State Department diplomat, and about 2 weeks before Iraq invaded Kuwait, Glaspie met with President Saddam Hussein, the brutal Iraqi dictator who was the U.S. ally during the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988. As the official representative of the United States in Baghdad, U.S. Ambassador Glaspie told Iraq the following: the U.S. has, quote, no opinion on your Arab conflicts, such as your dispute with Kuwait. Secretary of State Baker has directed me to emphasize the instruction of Iraq in the 1960s that the Kuwait issue is not associated with America, close quote. The emphasis was mine. In plain language, Iraq saw the U.S. giving Iraq a green light to invade Kuwait without any consequences. That tragic misunderstanding, miscommunication, I'll leave it at that, became the pivotal moment for the start of the current conflict. And just as a side note, how do we know this? WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks in 2012 finally published the secret cable where Glaspie described her conversation with Saddam Hussein. Now let me be clear. A single and very tragic misunderstanding is not the entire cause of the war, okay? There's centuries of political issues, religious issues, economic issues, and international intervention. I'm just talking about the spark that set the latest conflict into motion. Now I want to shift and talk about a few facts about the initial conduct of the Gulf War that is about 99% overlooked. It's very hard to find. We may know that Iraq overran Kuwait in 2 days. It was a blitzkrieg, similar to what the Nazis did to Poland in September of 1939. Most of the blow-by-blow coverage of the 90-91 Gulf War is well known. So let me shine a light on a little-known and pivotal event that foreshadows how our government treats our veterans in the Gulf War conflict starting in August 1990. Essentially, what happened is our Marines who were guarding our U.S. Embassy and our U.S. military advisors in Kuwait were captured by the Iraqi military. They were brutalized. They were held captive. Most of them were released right before the air bombing campaign in January 1991. They were released in December of 1990. Those service members did not receive a prisoner of war medal. They don't receive prisoner of war benefits. The military puts them in a special category called beleaguered. And as a result, the beleaguered status doesn't provide the automatic additional VA healthcare benefits that get triggered by prisoner of war status. That should have been the canary in the coal mine of what was going to come down the road for veterans later on. Next, I want to talk about another event that most folks know a little bit about, and that was the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton, paid millions of dollars by the Saudi and Kuwaiti government, launched a public relations campaign advocating the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The ads played repeatedly on TV, and Hill and Knowlton actually set up a fake congressional hearing to talk about how Iraqi soldiers were taking Kuwaiti babies from incubators and leaving them to die on the floor of Kuwaiti hospitals. It turned out, and later on in 91, that that was entirely fabricated. It didn't happen. Many members of Congress cite that propaganda repeatedly and why they voted to authorize the use of force in January 1991 and launch the U.S. air attacks and ground invasion of Iraq. Now, how close was that vote? It was 52 to 47 in the Senate. My question is this: is it reasonable to say that if 3 senators knew the facts, there would have been no Gulf War? I'm just raising the question. Unfortunately, we're never going to know the answer. In the House, the tally was 250 to 183. The propaganda worked. Here's an interesting side note. 2 votes later, Congress voted to give benefits to Vietnam veterans suffering from Agent Orange, It took them 36 years to get those benefits. Here's what happened. It all leads to this vote in April 1991, because you keep hearing me say that the war started in August 1990. But Congress voted to authorize going to war in January 1991. Paul's not making sense. The dates don't add up. Well, in an Orwellian George Winston twist, in April 1991, by a voice vote in the Senate and a 396-4 vote in the House, Congress retroactively set the Gulf War start date as August 2, 1990, without any end date. In order for the war to end, Congress or the President, Congress has to pass a law or the President has to sign an executive order to act and end the war. They have never done that. So one of the key points I want to emphasize here is first, the war's been going on 26 years, and next, at the very beginning, our military was not treating the veterans coming home properly. So let me drift into another topic here. Some of the consequences of war that aren't widely publicized. We know that there were 383 deaths in the war zone. We know that there's 250,000 Gulf War veterans from the 1990 to 1991 period who remained sick from toxic exposures. In Iraq, the range of deaths go from 20,000 to 200,000. The problem is there has been no stable government to make a reliable count so that we have any official number. And then the next question people ask is this: what happened between 91 and 2003? How is that still the Gulf War? And I say, well, we had sanctions, we had a blockade, we had an embargo, we had no-fly zones, we had these operations. But in plain language, Iraq was bombed, isolated, and starved for 12 years under the names Operation Northern Watch, Southern Watch, Desert Thunder, Desert Fox, and many more that I can't count up here. The press and the public picked up and used those names. And here's something funny as an aside. In March 2003, for those of us paying attention, the first name for the second invasion of Iraq was called Operation Iraqi Liberation. O-I-L. Okay, for those with spelling challenges, like me, that's oil. As soon as someone figured it out, they changed it, and it became Operation Iraqi Freedom. Sometimes I think they were just making fun of us with all these names. To complete the circle here about why words matter, the U.S. lexicon moved from war to operation. And for mass marketing in the movies, war is now merely the Hunger Games. And this is truly an insane twist about what's going on in society right now. If you want to learn more, there's a book about this thick, written by my friend John MacArthur. It's called Second Front: Censorship and Propaganda in the Gulf War. Now I'm going to shift to another more current situation where words do matter. This one involved me personally in a White House building. In December 2011, President Barack Obama gave a widely televised national television address. He said he was ending the Iraq War. There were live news broadcasts of U.S. military convoys exiting Iraq toward Kuwait. However, shortly before that, earlier in December, as the executive director of Veterans for Common Sense, building was right down the street here, I was in the old executive office building next to the White House. There was a conference, a meeting between the White House staff and veterans groups, and leading the conversation was a gentleman by the name of Ben Rhodes, President Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor. Rhodes said words to the effect that the Iraq War was over, finished, done. He said President Obama was fulfilling one of his main campaign promises to end the Iraq War. And I'm one of those voices in the back of the room, and people know me. I'll say something. So I said, hi. I politely asked Rhodes, is President Obama going to seek a declaration from Congress? Or will the president sign an executive order ending the war? I explained to Rhodes that service member pay, veterans benefits, and much more are linked to an existing status of war. I mentioned the 1991 law and said the war is continuing. Looking very confused, then Rhodes responded that ending a war was complicated. He then ignored my request for clarification, changed the subject, and moved on. What everyone really needs to know is even in private meetings, the pressure is to say the war is over, when in fact the war continues. And there's a new term. Right after the president said that the war in Iraq was ended, Operation Iraqi Freedom became Operation New Dawn. Wait a minute. I'm not over. Earlier this year, the military gave the conflict another new name, Operation Inherent Resolve. No, I'm not done yet. There's a new name for Operation Enduring Freedom in Iraq. Now it's called Operation Freedom's Sentinel. And my mind just can't get wrapped around how it's the same war. They just keep giving it a new name every couple of years or weeks. We use beleaguered instead of prisoner of war, operation instead of war. We're talking about Hunger Games when it's children killing children. It's hard, as I'm getting older, to wrap my head around what's going on with the language of what's going on. As many of you heard from Doug, a lot of my work began in talking about Gulf War illness. Yes, there's the horror of combat, death, destruction, but the reality was that the Gulf War zone was a toxic soup. We had B-52s bombing, we had rockets, we had artillery rounds, we had airplanes, we had helicopters, we had tanks, we had armored personnel carriers, we had small weapons fires. There were cluster bombs everywhere, there were mines everywhere. In addition to that, there were 700 oil well fires, the use of low levels of chemical warfare agents, experimental pills, pesticides used on our service members, and then the ammunitions used by our tanks and helicopters and close air support planes was made out of radioactive toxic waste. Instead of collecting information about toxic exposures and the amounts and the times, the military intentionally, yes, deliberately decided to ignore toxic exposures. There are military documents found using the Freedom of Information Act where the military set a policy of downplaying the environmental and health consequences of radioactive and toxic waste in the war zone. The memos call for highlighting the battlefield effectiveness of the weapons and downplaying the consequences to soldiers and veterans. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about just the group 1990-1991 veterans. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, 2001 to the present. There's a gap in the data there between 91 and 2001. And I'm just going to run through a couple of bullet points, because these I thought were the most important. 58% of the veterans deployed since 2001, according to the Veterans and IAVA, are service-connected for a mental health condition. Next up, before enlisting, about 6% of our veterans considered suicide. Today, it's 40%. That's more than a six-fold increase. The stats get worse. Remember how I talked about Gulf War illness? Now, 74% of Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans report they were around these toxins from the burn pits. Imagine a hole about the size of this sanctuary filled with garbage every day and burned because there's no dump and no incinerator. And the service members are living right about where House and Hall is and where the youth groups meet. So the toxic pollution was like living behind an old diesel bus in the city. Here's something I want to share, and it reflects on what I'm going to talk about in a minute. About 54% of the current Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans know a fellow veteran who has attempted suicide. About 45% of veterans from the past 15 years know a fellow veteran who completed suicide. Now, how do veterans feel about this? According to IAVA, here's what they reported. Who do veterans think is being proactive in helping our veterans? 38% of veterans believe VA is proactive. That's right, VA gets a pretty low score. VA has the best score. Think about that. The figure drops to 32% for the military, 15% for the president, and at the bottom, 14% of new veterans believe Congress is proactive for our veterans. What does that say about the disconnect between our veterans and the people we are electing to serve us? That's a lot of bad news. It really is. I was disheartened when I saw it. But as a former VA employee, I was glad to see VA at the top of the list. Now here's some good news. Among Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans, 17%, that's like 1 out of 6, have called VA's suicide hotline. Only 1% of the veterans surveyed did not know about the hotline. Wow. That means that the VA has penetrated to 99% awareness. If I could give a big thumbs up and a round of applause to VA, they did it. Okay? If you need help, the veterans know the hotline's there. 2.2 million veterans from all wars and peacetime have called the hotline. 58,000 veterans who've called the hotline have been rescued by VA, that's VA's term, and brought in for mental health care because they had an active plan to complete suicide. That's 58,000. Let me put this in context for folks here under like 60. There are 58,000 names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. That's the size of this campus. Here's some more good news. In July 2010, as Doug mentioned, VA changed the regulations based on scientific research about PTSD. Now veterans, about 400,000, are receiving benefits for PTSD when they wouldn't before. So let me ask this. Is VA actually reforming? And the answer is yes. But let me digress and tell you why I do this. I do this because one of my friends, who I was in the war with, he died in the war. One of my friends who tried to get care from VA and couldn't committed suicide. And for me, doing this has meaning. It's very important. If you want to flip open to the gray book in front of you, our tradition, and look at 583, you'll see that's where I derive my personal meaning on why I do what I do. It's a poem by Archibald MacLeish, a World War I veteran. He was a Librarian of Congress. And when you get a chance, when we're done, read it. And my ask here is that if you want to understand the purpose of how I come to do what I do, go ahead and read that and you'll see So did you know why VA set up the suicide hotline? It's because VA got sued. VA got sued by Veterans for Common Sense. Folks in this room know about that. It was great. Why did VA change the rules on the suicide benefits? It's because Veterans for Common Sense and other veterans groups demanded the change based on science. If I had to sum up what does VA really need right now, VA needs more doctors, VA needs more nurses, VA needs more support from our veterans to make sure VA is working properly. We don't need to privatize it. We need to fix it. We need to strengthen it. We need to know what it's doing and doing it well. Now I'm going to wrap up here and then we'll go to Q&A. During World War II, about 1 in 5 men went to war over a period of less than 4 years. Nearly everyone knew someone in the war. Blue Star flags and some Gold Star flags were displayed on windows in dense urban areas, and that's how folks knew that someone was in the war or died in the war. Today, after 26 years of long war and these spread out suburbs, almost no one sees a Blue Star flag. No one sees a Gold Star flag. No one on a day-to-day basis is interacting with the 1% of our population who've gone to the war back and forth for 26 years. And that's where I see the huge disconnect. And I always quote Winston Churchill here, and I paraphrase him and say, never have so many 310 million Americans owed so much to so few. And here are my final points to walk away. When you see on TV, someone says the war's over or that it's an operation, know that the war's been going on 26 years. When someone says war's not expensive, mention to them that right now the cost is $4.4 trillion and rising. Next, try to understand we're really living in a bubble here. It's not pleasant, but we do need to talk about caring for our veterans. And if you aren't involved and you want to make a difference, here's a couple of very simple things that you can do. The first is volunteer at the VA right here in Austin. The next is get engaged. Talk to your friends about the war. The next, write down VA's suicide hotline number. I have it with me. Write down VA's new homeless hotline. VA's reduced homelessness by more than 50%. We need to make sure that we keep moving in the direction of eliminating homelessness among our veterans. And I want to wrap up by saying, veterans and soldiers have a motto, and the motto is to leave no one behind. What I'm asking for here for our country, and we can do this here at our UU Church, is that our country should say we are going to leave no service member, no veteran, and no family member behind. And how long am I going to keep doing this? Until the war's over, until all our service members are home, and until no veteran is waiting for VA care. So thank you very much, Bonnie, and thank you very much, Doug.
And now we're going to take some questions. Would you raise your hands if you... Okay, we have a question from John Franks. John?
I think you mentioned 8,000 casualties for the war. How are the suicide casualties counted? Are they counted as war casualties, or does that go in another category? And also, do you think there's been a deliberate attempt to conceal the cost of the war from the people? In the past wars, they always raised taxes during wartime. In this war, they did not.
So let me answer the first question. If a service member completes suicide in the war zone, that's a death in the war zone, and it will be included on the nearly 8,000 deaths in the war zone. The next question is about paying for the war. You're right, the war has been paid for on a credit card. There was no tax increase. There's been no rationing. There hasn't been. There's been very little economic impact, except you keep hearing that the national debt is going up. The national debt has gone up to about $14 trillion now, and it's safe to say that at least $4 trillion or more of that is actually directly attributable to the war.
Any other questions? We must have more questions. Douglas?
A number of years ago, I had a young expat working for me from Austria. And in Austria, everybody has to do a short stint in the military. And one of the things that he observed there was that they trained incoming soldiers on video games, which were basically war simulations, because they found that soldiers were much more likely to pull a trigger if they had pulled it in a video game. Could you comment on your own thoughts on that?
I can explain how I was trained to be a soldier, and it begins with carrying around your weapon, learning all the parts, disassembling it, assembling it, giving it a name, knowing the serial number, and then you start by firing at a square to make sure you know how to properly use the weapon. Then you're firing at a circle, and you're improving your aim, and then the target takes the shape of a silhouette from about chest high. And then in order to actually be certified to fire your weapons as a soldier, at the time I went through basic training as a cavalry scout at Fort Knox, it was actually lifelike targets that would pop up. So we went from no familiarity with a weapon to knowing how to use it, and then having the reflexive training to know a target immediately and then to pull the trigger. And it takes about 15 weeks to take a citizen right off the street and have him or her reflexively pull the trigger accurately. And there's a question over here.
Yeah, we have a question from Russell Eskew. Russell?
Suicide. Do these soldiers believe that what they're doing is wrong? Is that a reason?
I wish I had an answer for you. I truly do. Part of the problem first was actually getting our government to keep track of who was attempting and then who was completing suicide. Then that's a problem because a lot of times a death certificate will show one car crash. And sometimes a family may be hesitant to say it's a suicide when they don't know or the answer is murky. I think it's very important to delve into the reasons why. That's very important. Is it the war? Is it something the war exacerbated, like a family problem or a financial problem? What's going on, okay? But what's most important for us right now, as advocates and as veterans, is to be able to tell our veterans straight up, look them right in the eye, and say, if you need someone to talk to, you can pick up the phone, and there will be a professional on the other end, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to get you help. The reasons, yes, they're important, so that we can do more for our service members, veterans, and their family members. But at this point, what we're focusing on is reducing suicides, because suicide is one of the very few acts that's completely preventable. If we let our veterans know we are welcomed home, if we make sure when a veteran wants to get care, he or she gets it right away, okay, and they can start to address the other problems, then I believe we can start to see a reduction in suicide. There's one other note about this, and I think there might be some people from VA in the room. When our veterans go to VA, their likelihood of completing suicide goes down. What that says in plain English is veterans who reach out for help get the help they need, okay? And that's what we really want to do. But the other part of that is making sure our families know what to expect when veterans come home. Veterans know what to do, employers know what to do, friends know what to do. when we see something and we know VA's phone number, 1-800-273-TALK, we know we can get a veteran linked right in for care. And there's efforts in Texas to share with other veterans this important information, because most of the time, the first person a veteran is going to reach out to for help, sorry to say this, may not be a spouse. It may not be a friend. It may not be a coworker, not the boss, not the minister. It's going to be another veteran. So the most important thing, and that's what I was very glad to see, 99% of our veterans know where to go to get help. The next part is making sure our veterans know it's okay to pick up the phone and call for help, because you're going to get the help you need and it'll work.
We have about 5 minutes left, and we have a question from Jim Bryce. Jim?
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. I have a question directed to the issue of women now in combat. I have a friend who lives approximately a mile from here. I wish I'd known, had gotten your topic. She should be here. She's a vet, an Air Force pilot that was injured in Afghanistan, and is now taking up the cause of women. Molly Mae Potter, she's put her name up to represent women in these issues. My understanding is some of the facilities, medical things and so forth within the VA have been very limited for women. Gynecologists, et cetera, have not been broadly available. Are you aware of what has been done in the VA and what efforts are being made to cure that deficiency? Because we're having many women injured now in serious combat.
If you want to know, frankly, who's making a difference, it's our women veterans who aren't shy about it, telling VA leaders or their health professionals, nurses, clerks, doctors at the VA, hi, and just use some imagery. The door opens the wrong way for an exam room. The doctor may not be appropriate because he may be male, and the patient at VA may be a rape trauma survivor. It's very important to address those issues, waiting room issues. When I listened to women here in Austin describe this, they described how they would sit in a waiting room, and this sounds bad, but I saw it myself, they would be hit on by men. Oh, is your husband here? Is your dad here? What's slowly happening is the culture is evolving. This is important, and it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. It's part education, letting veterans know in the VA, now 1 out of 7, 1 out of 8 of the veterans in the hospital or in the clinic are women. The woman there isn't a spouse, and she's not going to have been a clerk. She may have led troops in combat. Okay, we all bleed red, unless you're Air Force, we all wear green, right? Is it the Air Force that still wears blue? The point I'm trying to make is we have to make sure that we're treating everyone with dignity and respect in what they earned. And here in Austin, I can tell you, I've seen it myself, where the women came and met with administrators and made a lot of changes in how care for women is being addressed. And if they do have challenges, there's a woman veteran employee specifically at the facility to listen to and address any concerns. This is actually very important, and it's working.
We have a question here. Would you stand and say your name, please?
Hi, I'm a fellow Calf Scout, by the way. So thanks for being here. It's a great presentation, by the way. So part of the biggest issue with veteran suicides was because soldiers were afraid of retaliation, and they didn't want to say that they had issues in their unit. Has that gotten better? And if not, how do we bridge that gap? Soldiers saying, hey, I need help, but feeling comfortable to say what they speak, whether it be in a healthcare setting or military setting?
The very quick, short answer is it's about cultural competency. And it starts with the sergeant in the unit, the lieutenant, and the captain, works its way all the way to the top. when there is a climate that if someone can't sleep, they're feeling depressed, they've seen some horrific stuff in combat, they've seen their friends die, children die, all that kind of stuff that is difficult to process in a war zone. If that leader, from the sergeant to the 4-star general, is made aware that it's real, help is there, veterans should be encouraged to go get it, and that it works, we're changing the culture. It takes time. And I know more and more leaders in the military are being trained on it, and I can say that compared to 10 or 15 years ago, it's far better. Are there still isolated incidents where doctors will say we want to kick someone out to save money? Yes. Are there isolated incidents where doctors might say they don't believe in PTSD? Yes. Are there some commanders that believe a service member is just trying to get out of duty by saying they can't sleep after something that they participated in or saw? It's still there. However, it's a cultural change, and I believe we're definitely moving in the right direction. And the reason I know this is because more veterans are calling VA's hotline. It's a curve going up. We know more veterans are filing claims for and getting care for PTSD when they need it. It's going up. So, yes, there's still some stigma, and it comes from some of the officers, but I think it's going down. So the bottom line is you need care, ask for it, it's there, and it helps.
Paul, we want to thank you so much for taking time to talk to us. This is such an important national issue, and you're giving us a insider's perspective that I don't think is available anywhere else. So thank you again. Let's give him a big hand.